He was 51 years old and had $20, not $20 until payday. $20 total, in his wallet, in the front pocket of a pair of jeans he'd washed in a gas station bathroom sink that morning, because he didn't have a laundromat and hadn't yet. $1 of that 20 went toward a crumbling farmhouse at the end of a gravel road in Garfield County, Ohio, a place the bank had listed as uninhabitable, and the county had condemned on a Tuesday, and nobody had wanted for going on 3 years. People said he was lost. They said the divorce had broken something in him that wasn't going to come back. But what none of them knew was that somewhere inside that collapsed farmhouse, behind a heavy iron safe door that had been rusted shut for longer than anyone could remember, was something a man named Thomas Earl Pruitt had spent 30 years building in secret. Something that would not only pull Martin Kessler back to his feet, but would quietly and completely silence every person who had counted him out. If you're new here, welcome. This channel tells true-style stories about ordinary people who found something unexpected on the other side of loss. If that's the kind of story that stays with you, we'd be glad to have you subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means a great deal to us. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every one. Martin Kessler had grown up in Sandusky, Ohio, the son of a man who repaired small engines for a living, lawnmowers, generators, outboard motors, and a mother who managed the bookkeeping for 3 small businesses in town and came home smelling of copy paper and black coffee. He was the middle of 3 boys, unremarkable in the way that middle children sometimes are. Not the oldest who carries the weight of expectation, and not the youngest who is forgiven everything. Just the one in the middle, who learns to be useful and doesn't make much noise about it. He was good with his hands. He had his father's patience for mechanical things and his mother's eye for what the numbers actually meant. He was not a man who talked much. He was a man who fixed things. He had married Karen Blevins in 1997, when he was 24 and she was 22, at a small ceremony in her parents' backyard in July, with paper lanterns in the trees and a cake her aunt had made from a recipe that came out of a notebook. He remembered the notebook. It had a red cover, and her aunt had kept it open on the table the whole reception, weighted down with a coffee mug. And he had thought at the time that there was something he liked very much about a family that kept its recipes written down and worn soft with use. He wanted to belong to that kind of family. For a long time, he thought he did. They had 2 children, a daughter, Becca, who was now 24 and lived in Columbus and worked in hospital administration, and a son, Drew, who was 21 and finishing a degree in mechanical engineering at Ohio State, which Martin was quietly proud of in a way he found difficult to express. He had been a decent father. He believed that honestly, without self-pity or inflation. He had coached Little League for 6 years. He had driven to every school play and sat in the folding chairs in the gymnasium and applauded. He had been present. He had not been exciting or brilliant or particularly financially successful, but he had been there reliably for 27 years, and he had believed, in the way that people believe in things they've never tested, that this was what mattered most. He had worked at the same machine shop for 18 years, started on the floor running a lathe, moved up to floor supervisor at 38, and had learned along the way that a machine shop ran on 2 things: the quality of the people you hired and the patience of the person watching over them. He was good at both. He was not a man who raised his voice on the floor. He didn't need to. He had a way of explaining what was wrong with something that left the other person feeling capable rather than corrected, and his people stayed. Some of them had been with him the whole 18 years. He thought of them as his people, and they were, and that had been enough to be proud of even in the years when other things were not going as well as he'd hoped. The marriage had not failed in a single moment. That was the thing he kept coming back to in the furnished room on Clement Street, in the small hours when sleep would not come. There had been no event, no betrayal, no clear line he could point to and say, "There, that is where it ended." It had simply, over a period of years that he could not precisely date, become two people living politely in the same house, arranging their schedules around each other with the efficiency of people who have stopped expecting anything to be different. He was not without fault in this. He knew that. He had worked long hours and come home tired and sat in front of the television more evenings than he should have, and assumed, without examining the assumption, that being present physically was the same thing as being present. It was not the same thing. He understood this now. He would have preferred to understand it at a time when understanding it could have made a difference, but that was not how it had happened. The divorce was filed on a Thursday morning in March. He found out when his phone showed a notification from a legal firm he'd never heard of. Karen had hired them 6 weeks before without telling him. He called her. She didn't answer. She texted him, 2 hours later, a single line, "The papers are coming to your work address. I think that's easier." He had sat in his truck in the parking lot of the machine shop where he worked as a floor supervisor and read that text 4 times. He had not cried. He had driven home, made himself a sandwich he didn't eat, and gone to bed at 7:30 in the evening and stared at the ceiling until 2 in the morning. The house was hers. Technically, she had inherited it from her parents, which the attorneys had used to establish it as separate property, and Martin had known this for 27 years and had never once thought about it as leverage, because it had never occurred to him that leverage would be necessary. The savings account had $17,000 in it, which was divided, and then the attorneys took their portion. And then there were the months of living in a furnished room above a hardware store on Clement Street, where the heat came on whenever it wanted, and the couple in the next room argued in low, exhausted voices through the wall every Friday night. And by the time the whole thing was concluded and settled and signed, Martin Kessler had $20 and a truck with 187,000 miles on it, and the furniture that had been in his father's garage, a workbench, a chest freezer that no longer worked, and a metal folding chair. He was not broken. He knew people thought he was, including his brother Carl, who called every 2 weeks with a voice that had careful optimism built into it the way you build a ramp, sloping, deliberate, designed for someone who can't manage the steps. Martin appreciated the calls. He just didn't need the ramp. He was not broken. He was empty, which was different. Empty could be filled. Broken required something else entirely, and he hadn't gotten there yet, and he intended not to. He found the listing by accident. He was not looking for property. He was sitting in the public library in Crestfield on a Wednesday evening. He went to the library on Wednesday evenings because it was warm and quiet and nobody expected anything of him there, and he had been browsing the county's delinquent property list on one of the library computers, because he did that sometimes, the way other people read the obituaries, not out of morbidity but out of a kind of habit, an interest in what gets left behind and what it costs. The listing was 3 lines long. Rural parcel, Garfield County Road 14, approximately 2.3 acres, farmhouse structure in collapsed condition, assessed value $1, taxes in arrears 14 months, total owed $983. $1 for the deed transfer. He wrote down the address on the back of his library card. He drove out on a Saturday. County Road 14 ran south from the state route through flat farmland and then climbed slightly into a low ridge of second-growth maple and oak before descending again into a hollow where a creek ran along the property line. The farmhouse sat about 60 yards from the road behind a collapsed wire fence. It had been a 2-story structure once. You could see the shape of what it had been in the standing portions of the outer walls, which rose to about 8 feet on the north and west sides before giving out. The south wall had caved inward entirely, taking most of the second floor with it. The roof was gone except for a section over what had been the kitchen, where a few rafters still held a patch of rusted tin that moved slightly in the wind. There was a fieldstone foundation that showed well above grade, solid-looking even now, and a brick chimney at the east end that was still standing to full height, a little canted, but plumb enough. And, at the back of what had been the main room, half buried under fallen ceiling plaster and 2 collapsed floor joists, there was a safe. It was old. Cast iron, the kind that had been made in the 1920s or 1930s, set into an alcove in the east wall that had been built around it deliberately. You could see the framing was designed to hold it. The studs doubled on either side. The door was shut. There was no visible combination dial, just a keyhole below a simple handle, and the keyhole had rusted to a uniform brown red that matched everything else. The safe was roughly the size of a small dresser. It would have weighed, Martin estimated, somewhere between 300 and 400 pounds. He stood and looked at it for a long time. He drove back to Crestfield and called the county office on Monday morning. The woman he reached was named Shirley, and she was the kind of county employee who had been doing the job long enough to find a certain dry humor in the particulars of it. She confirmed the taxes owed. She confirmed the deed transfer price. She asked if he had actually been out there and seen the condition. "I have," Martin said. "And you want it anyway," Shirley said. It was not quite a question. "I want it anyway," he said. His brother Carl called that evening, because Martin had mentioned the property to him, and Carl spent 15 minutes explaining why this was inadvisable. He said the word liability 4 times. He said, "Martin, come on," twice. Martin listened to all of it. "I hear you," Martin said, when Carl had finished. "But you're doing it," Carl said. "I'm doing it," Martin said. He signed the deed on a Friday afternoon in Shirley's office, which smelled of old carpet and the particular brand of hand sanitizer that county offices had used since forever. And he drove out to County Road 14 that evening with a thermos of coffee and sat on the fieldstone foundation in the last of the October light and thought about what a person could reasonably do with a collapsed farmhouse. $1 of equity, and the better part of his life still left to live. A truck slowed on the road and then pulled into the lane, an older Ford, dark green, with a homemade wooden toolbox across the bed. The man who got out was somewhere in his late 60s, lean, with a weathered look that came from working outside for decades and not from anything else. He walked over without hurrying. "Saw the Crestfield plates," the man said. "Figured someone had finally bought it." His name was Ray Dutto. He farmed the land to the north. Soybeans and corn, 400 and some acres, had been in his family since his grandfather's time. He said he'd known Thomas Pruitt, who had owned the farmhouse and the 3 acres until he died 4 years ago, at 83, with no family anyone had been able to locate. He said Thomas had been a private man, friendly enough in the way that private men sometimes are. He'd wave from the lane. He'd come to the grain elevator in town. He'd help if you needed help. But he didn't talk about himself, and he didn't invite people in, and after 30 years of neighboring Ray, had still felt he'd known only the outside edge of the man. "What happened to it?" Martin asked, meaning the house. Ray looked at the collapsed south wall. Thomas let it go the last few years. He was in his 80s. Roof went, and once the roof went, the rest followed. He paused. County was going to demo it, but the demo estimate was more than the assessed value, so they just condemned it and listed it. "Been sitting." "The safe," Martin said. "You know anything about it?" Ray looked at him steadily. "I know it's there. Everybody who ever came through knew it was there." He put his hands in his coat pockets. Nobody got it open. Thomas wouldn't discuss it. He'd changed the subject. Not rude about it, just final, like the subject was over, and that was that. Martin nodded. "Good luck to you," Ray said, and walked back to his truck without elaborating, which Martin respected. The first winter was hard work and careful money. Martin moved into the farmhouse, into the kitchen section, the one piece of roof that was still intact. In November, after he'd cleared enough debris from the kitchen floor to set up his sleeping bag on an inflatable pad, run an extension cord from the utility pole at the road, and confirmed that the kitchen wood stove, a cast iron range that was older than he was, still drew. He had his truck and his tools and $260 left after the taxes and the deed, and he spent the first of it on a used tarp large enough to cover the collapsed section and keep the rain off the foundation while he figured out what came next. What came next was Ray Dutto, who appeared one Saturday morning with his son-in-law, a big quiet man named Joe, and the two of them helped Martin move the largest section of fallen ceiling beam without being asked and without making anything of it. Ray said afterward that he wanted to see the foundation cleared, not for Martin's sake, but for the sake of knowing what was under there. And Martin understood this was a polite fiction designed to make the help easier to accept, and so he accepted it in that spirit. After that, Ray came by most Saturdays, sometimes with Joe, sometimes alone, and they would work for a few hours and then stand at the back of the truck and drink coffee from Ray's thermos, which was a battered green Stanley that he'd had for 30 years and which made better coffee than it had any right to. It was Ray who found the locksmith. His name was Phil Enner, and he operated out of a shop on the edge of Millbury, 12 miles east, and he had a particular interest in antique locks that had calcified into an expertise over 40 years. He came out on a Thursday in December, driving a small sedan that looked incongruous on County Road 14, and he spent the better part of an hour with a headlamp and a set of dental picks and a can of penetrating oil working at the keyhole of the safe before he sat back on his heels and looked at Martin with an expression that was respectful rather than defeated. "I can open it," he said. "Not today. I need to come back with a different tool. I have a specialty extractor that works on this type of mechanism. Cast iron D-bolt, probably 1931 or 32 based on the handle hardware." He tapped the door gently with one knuckle. These were built to stay shut. That's the point of them. But they can be opened without drilling if you have the right tool and enough patience. "I have patience," Martin said. Phil came back the following Tuesday with a long-handled tool that looked like something between a torque wrench and a dentist's instrument, and he worked the lock for 2 hours and 20 minutes while Martin stood to one side and tried to appear calmer than he felt. At some point, Ray showed up unannounced and stood on the other side, and also tried to appear calm. Neither of them said much. Phil didn't seem to notice. The lock released with a sound that was less dramatic than Martin had imagined, a low iron clunk, internal, like a thought completing itself. Phil took hold of the handle and pulled. The door swung outward on hinges that had held their grease for decades, and the interior of the safe came into the light for what may have been the first time in a very long while. If you're still with us, thank you. Genuinely, we know there are 100 other things you could be doing with your evening, and we don't take that lightly. If you've been enjoying this story, please go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps us more than you might think. And now, because what was inside that safe is going to take some time to fully understand, here is what Martin Kessler found. There were documents, a great many of them, organized with a precision that suggested Thomas Pruitt had understood that no one would be there to explain them and had arranged them accordingly. They were in a series of labeled envelopes, each sealed in a zip-close plastic bag to protect against the changes in temperature and humidity that a building suffers when its roof goes. The first envelope contained the deed to the 2.3 acres and the farmhouse, Thomas's copy, which Martin already effectively had, though this one had a handwritten note clipped to it that read, "The land is worth more than the county thinks." Look at the Eastern Creek boundary. Martin did not immediately understand this. The second envelope contained Thomas Pruitt's discharge papers from the United States Army, dated 1963, and a photograph of a young man in uniform standing in front of a building that Martin didn't recognize, squinting slightly into the sun, with the same self-contained expression that Ray had described in 30 years of neighboring. The third envelope was thicker than the others. Inside was a passbook from a bank in Columbus, Citizens Savings, the old kind with handwritten entries, and a series of brokerage statements in a manila folder, each one paper clipped to the one before it. Martin sat down on an overturned crate and went through them slowly, while Ray stood beside him and read over his shoulder without apologizing for it, which Martin didn't mind. Thomas Pruitt had been buying stock. Not wildly, not recklessly, but steadily and patiently, for 32 years, in the shares of 4 companies: a manufacturing firm out of Cincinnati, a utility company, a regional bank, and a food distributor out of Columbus that had since been acquired by a larger company. He had reinvested every dividend. He had never, as far as Martin could tell from the statements, sold a single share. The most recent statement was dated 14 months ago. It had been prepared and presumably mailed to the farmhouse address, where it had presumably waited in whatever remained of the mailbox until the post office flagged the address as undeliverable. The value of the portfolio as of 14 months ago was $421,680. Martin read that number twice. Then he set the statement down and looked at the cold December light coming through the section of missing roof, and he did not say anything for a long time. The fourth envelope contained a letter. It was written in the same precise, economical hand that had labeled the other envelopes, the handwriting of a man who chose his words carefully and did not waste them. It said, "I have no family. I have looked. The cousins are gone, and the ones that aren't I have no dealings with. I have left this to whoever buys the land, because whoever buys the land will be someone who saw something in it worth having, and that is the kind of person I want to have it. There are conditions. You will find them on the second page." The conditions were 3. First, the farmhouse was to be rebuilt, not demolished, and was to be used as a residence, not sold for parts or profit, for a period of no less than 7 years. Second, the eastern boundary of the property, where the creek ran, was to remain undeveloped and was to be left in its natural state, because Thomas had watched the wood ducks on that creek for 20 years and considered them a sufficient reason for a condition. Third, and this was the one that took Martin the longest to read and reread and finally understand, a sum of $20,000 from the portfolio was to be used within 2 years of the transfer for the benefit of a cause the new owner found worthy. Not prescribed, not designated, left to the judgment of whoever stood where Martin was standing. That was all. Martin sat in the cold kitchen of the collapsed farmhouse for a long time after Phil Enner had packed up his tools and gone quietly home, and Ray had eventually excused himself with a handshake that lasted a moment longer than handshakes usually do. He sat with the documents in his lap and the safe door standing open behind him and the creek sound coming through where the south wall used to be, and he thought about Thomas Pruitt buying 4 stocks and never selling them, and watching wood ducks on a creek boundary and dying at 80. 3 with everything he'd built waiting patiently in an iron box for whoever had enough left in them to come looking. The attorneys that handled the estate transfer were in Columbus. They had been holding Thomas's will, a minimal document, 2 pages, that named the farmhouse property as the entirety of the estate and directed everything to its future owner. For 4 years waiting for someone to make a claim. They were professional and thorough and somewhat astonished, though they kept that mostly out of their voices. The transfer took 3 months and a great deal of paperwork, during which Martin continued to live in the kitchen section of the farmhouse, continued to work with Ray on Saturdays, and continued to go to the library on Wednesday evenings, though now he went to research building permits and structural lumber costs and the particular requirements of restoring a fieldstone foundation, which turned out to be less complicated than he'd feared. Karen found out through Drew. Martin had told Drew in a phone call in February not to make a point of it, but because Drew was his son and he didn't want his son to hear it from somewhere else. Drew had apparently told Karen in the way that adult children tell their parents things they think they should know, and Karen had called Martin on a Sunday morning with a tone of voice he hadn't heard from her in a long time. Careful, measuring, "Is it true?" she said. "It's true," Martin said. There was a pause. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said. "Better than fine." She said she was glad, and he believed she meant it, and they hung up, and that was that. He did not feel triumphant. He had thought he might, and he didn't. What he felt was simply that things were settled, that the accounting was complete. He put his phone in his pocket and went out to look at the creek boundary in the February cold, where the ice was pulling back from the banks, and he stood there for a while thinking about wood ducks and what a man decides to protect. He broke ground on the restoration in April. He hired a contractor from Millbury named Dave Serrano, who had experience with historical farmhouse structures, and who spent 2 days walking the site before he gave a number, which he said he preferred to do because numbers given without looking were numbers that came back to trouble everybody. The number he gave was workable, not comfortable, but workable, and Martin had learned the difference between those 2 things a long time ago. Ray's son-in-law, Joe, turned out to be a Finnish carpenter of real ability, which Ray mentioned one Saturday as if it were a minor detail, and Joe came on weekends when the work called for it and never once made Martin feel the help was charity, which was its own kind of skill. By September, the roof was on. By November, the walls were closed in and the windows glazed and the wood stove in the kitchen pulling clean. Martin moved out of the inflatable pad and sleeping bag and into a bed. A real one, second-hand from an estate sale in Crestfield, with a headboard of dark walnut that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. He lay in it the first night and listened to the creak and the wind in the maple trees and the particular silence of a house that has been repaired, which is different from the silence of a house that has been left, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was still tight. He thought about the $20,000 and what Thomas Pruitt had left to his judgment. He thought about it for a long time over the winter, turning it over the way you turn a problem in your hands until the shape of it becomes clear. In February, he drove to the county social services office in the county seat and sat with a woman named Carol Finch, who ran the housing assistance program, and he asked her what the most common reason was that people in the county lost stable housing. She said without hesitation, security deposits. People who could afford monthly rent could not come up with first and last month plus deposit, and so they stayed in bad situations or ended up without an address at all, and once you didn't have an address, everything else became harder. Martin thought about a furnished room on Clement Street and the couple arguing through the wall on Friday nights and $20 in a coat pocket. He set up a fund. He didn't name it after himself. He named it after the man who had made it possible. The Thomas E. Pruitt Housing Assistance Fund, administered through the County Social Services Office, available to working adults in Garfield County who needed help with a security deposit. Carol Finch shook his hand twice when he left. She was not a woman who usually shook hands twice. The wood ducks came back in March. Martin was at the creek boundary at 6 in the morning when they arrived. 4 of them, the drake iridescent in the early light, landing in the slow water above the ice shelf at the creek bend, with a sound like a small, satisfied negotiation. He stood very still and watched them for a long time. He had not known before Thomas Pruitt that he cared about wood ducks. He cared about them now. There are moments in a life that divide it into a before and an after. Most of them are losses, a death, a departure, a thing that ends, but some of them are something else. Martin Kessler had been 51 years old and had $20 and no floor under him. And then he had driven down a gravel road to a collapsed farmhouse and found a safe that a patient, private man had trusted to the right hands, and the floor had come back. Not the same floor. A better one. One he'd helped build with his own hands from the ground up, which turned out to matter more than he would have expected. He was 53 now. He had a house that was solid and warm and his. He had 2 kids who called on Sundays. He had a neighbor who came by on Saturdays with a green thermos and no agenda. He did not have everything. He had never had everything, but he had the creek, and the wood ducks, and the fieldstone foundation, and the iron safe that stood open in the corner of the main room, where he kept it, because it seemed right to keep it, and every now and then he would put his hand on the door, heavy, cold, built to last, and think about a man who had spent 32 years being patient and particular, and had trusted a stranger with the whole of it. He left the porch light on every night, not for any reason he could have easily explained, just because a dark porch on a fixed house seemed like an oversight, and he had spent enough of his life in rooms where the light was uncertain. Sometimes the right door opens when you have just about nothing left. Sometimes the thing that was waiting has been waiting for you in particular, for longer than you knew, in a place you never thought to look. You just have to be the kind of person who drives down the road anyway. If this story moved you, we'd love it if you'd subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And here is our question for you in the comments. Has there been a moment in your life when you had almost nothing left and something unexpected came through? We would genuinely love to know. Those stories matter. Those are the ones worth telling. Thank you for spending this time with us. Take care of yourselves out there. We'll see you in the next one.